Okay, guys, I think we're going. Modern East Asia. Let's make sure. Okay, yep. So this is a recording for our scheduled class session on Friday, October 23rd. So please just be aware of that. Again, my hope is that we're all back, on the regular Zoom room class rotation thing on Monday, but we don't know yet what's going to happen there. So when we do come back, it'll be Group B in the classroom and Group A in the Zoom room, whether that's Monday or Wednesday or what have you. Just a reminder. And we're going to keep making our way through World War II here. So I've been getting some film review submissions from you guys regarding the various options. So that's good. Some of you have chosen to do a few of the films during this World War II era, and I've been looking at those, and just some phenomenally well done movies. So I appreciate those. I'm gonna try to get back into the grading system either later today or perhaps over the weekend and get some more stuff done. So, but please keep up with the reading and obviously make sure that you don't leave off film reviews for too long. Okay. All right. So let's go back. We're gonna actually talk a little bit about go back to Europe for a short time, and then we'll ultimately finish off with the campaigns in Asia a little bit more for the class session on Monday and then Wednesday. So we have this session that we're doing right here, and then two more after it, and that will get us through. I think we'll be just about exactly where we need to be. Okay, so on your outline, I didn't leave a spot for it, but I think it's important that we of course acknowledge one of the major ethical issues of the 20th century, and of course that's the Nazi Holocaust of the Second World War, and the ideology of the Nazis being, if we think about blame placing, it's at the heart and core of some of this. Now, let's be clear, anti-Semitism is certainly not invented by the Nazis during the 1930s and 40s. Anti-Semitism had been quite prominent in much of Europe and in North America for some time. So, but it takes a particularly vile, turn and a form under the Nazis. And, it's based on a completely fictional narrative about, Hitler spinning this yarn about not just Hitler, but Hitler and Goebbels and the Nazi high command spinning these yarns about the betrayal of the Jews during the First World War, during and after the First World War, and that there was a history of betrayal on the part of German Jews in particular over the preceding couple of centuries. Unfortunately, Martin Luther back in the 16th century became increasingly anti-Semitic, very virulently anti-Semitic, and so the Nazis draw on that as well and bring in, one of the great Christian reform leaders who later in life just, Luther really went hog wild with some of his anti-Semitism the last few years of his life in particular, and it may be that Luther was, of course, about as critical of every human being on the planet as he could probably be, but it doesn't save him from deserving some recrimination and critique for all of this. And so the Nazis bring in Martin Luther, like we would see in other pockets of the war. There's a fair amount of dehumanization that goes on, that we've talked about already with the Japanese in the Pacific theater. And there's an element of dehumanization that goes on in any human conflict, of course, but this is something that's even more concerning and more vile. You see here, one of the reasons I use this slide is just so that you have an idea of the policy that works its way to the forefront, that ultimately is in play in a structural, formalized sense by early 1943, and yet the final solution, the plan to ultimately not only relocate Jews, but of course to execute them. That so-called final solution plan ultimately is in play in 1943. You see that the various death camps that exist here are kind of, spotted around, Central and Eastern Europe in particular. And I think for all of us, when we try to wrestle with the reality of the Holocaust and what the Germans did, there's part of this that, since we aren't of German extract, we weren't living in Germany ourselves, our parents and grandparents weren't German, or great grandparents in your cases, and maybe it's tempting to just kind of remove ourselves from this horrible atrocity in the mid 20th century. But of course, this isn't the only, this isn't the only kind of atrocity. This isn't the only abomination of the 20th century regarding a purge like this. And if you go back to the Armenian genocide after the First World War, we see some things going on there. There are a sequence of genocides during the Cold War era and in the 1990s and 2000s. And whenever these happen, of course, they force us to ask some critical questions. And, it doesn't take long for, anyone who digs into the Holocaust and into the ideology, the disturbing rationales, the excuses for relocating Jews and Poles and Gypsies and homosexuals and Orthodox Christian ministers who were defying the Nazi regime. All of these people were grouped together in one sense as enemies of the state. But of course, the Jews themselves had this attached ethnic hatred that the German people under the Nazis were bestowing upon them. And the dehumanization part that I was talking about a minute ago is absolutely critical. It is vile, of course. It is an absolute falsehood. It is, obviously very scary in a couple of different ways, which I'll talk about in a minute. But what's scary for me is, and most historians who have worked through the Holocaust, is the empirical, organized element with the Holocaust that the Nazis put in play. I mean, when you see humans brutalize other human beings, oftentimes it's in such clear-cut, it's often in ways that you encounter, like watching armies fight one another. There's sometimes atrocities that take place during and after combat. When you watch something like the Holocaust, I think it is the rationales put in place, similar with the rationales for the institution of slavery. There is this clear-cut evil that makes the whole event, the whole process, even more disturbing. And the ways in which the Nazis planned and executed this systematic erasure, or erasing of an entire group of human beings, it's that systematic element and the ways in which they forced Jews out of their homes. Then they would go in and they would document what was, the various parts of the Jewish family's ownership, whatever it may be, all the implements from spectacles to pieces of clothing to jewelry to whatever it may be. And all of it was documented very specifically. And of course, then many, many prominent Nazis would take over the homes of these formerly prominent, in many cases, very prominent Jewish families living in Germany. There's that part of it that just is so hard to wrestle with and to see how, how cold-hearted and removed in a psychological sense the Nazis, the Nazi apostles, the Nazis themselves and all of their apostles were, who carried this plan out. Um, it's an important thing for all of us to remember for a number of different reasons, but I think one of them is this, and that is, it's a reminder, I think, that the realities of the human fall are with us. And if we are foolish enough to believe that what happened in Germany and Eastern Europe during World War II with the Holocaust, if we're foolish enough to believe that that cannot happen in our own time, then we have not learned the lessons very well. I think the other thing that's disturbing about the Holocaust, if we're not talking about some of the big, death camps like Auschwitz or what have you, it's important to remember that a lot of these camps, a lot of the concentration camps were work camps, and they were spread very consistently throughout, certainly Germany, but parts of Austria and and into Poland as well, in Eastern Europe. And the fact of the matter is that there is a complicity for those who understood what was happening in and around their town and village, as many of their towns and villages were actually supplying what the Nazis needed to carry out these campaigns, these abominable campaigns. And it's one of the reasons that there is, a judgment to be made against the German people broadly for, in many cases, standing aside and allowing this to occur, right within their own communities. And it's just hard to imagine these scenarios without having lived through them ourselves or knowing people that did. I personally do not know any Holocaust survivors, in my family or in my extended family going back in time. Part of me obviously is exceedingly grateful for that, but it's hard to make connections to these atrocities without having these direct human connections to be able to be able to draw from. I think for a lot of people who, when they think about the Holocaust and they think about World War II, maybe I've met a lot of people who know about the Holocaust, but they've never been to one of the Holocaust museums, or if they've been in Europe, they have not actually taken the time to go and visit one of the camps. Many people I talk to, I found that they haven't done something even as simple as watch through a film like Schindler's List, which is obviously portraying some of the horrible realities and atrocities of the Holocaust. And I've also been aware throughout the course of my adult life that there are far more Holocaust deniers than I ever would have believed. And over the last 20, 25 years or more, I've encountered quite a few. I even encountered some in academia. There was a guy at the University of Colorado when I was working on my master's degree. His name was Ward Churchill, and at the time he was still employed there. Ultimately, he was fired, but he was a clear-cut Holocaust denier and said some outlandish things. And I would just say that this is one of those examples of this radically subjective postmodern world we're living in, where people believe that they get to kind of create their own facts and create their own narratives based on all sorts of flawed information or what they were taught when they were brought up or whatever the case may be. And even at Corbin, I just in passing, I've had a few students from families over the years who are Holocaust deniers, and I had to kind of wrestle with that and try to steer the student on the right path, which has not always gone well. So even within Christian circles, you will occasionally encounter Holocaust deniers, and it's a real tragedy when that happens. 6.5 million, 6.5 million people dead as a result of these Nazi policies and these rationales that are put in place for the idea that Jews in particular weren't even really people, and that they were the scum of the earth, and they were no better than rats, and they had sold out humanity going back in time, and all the rest. It's just an absolutely horrific reality. And when we start talking about the realization that occurs when the world becomes aware of what was taking place in Europe under this Nazi policy, you'd like to think that their reactions, which were mostly sound and, as you would expect them to be, very, just people aghast at the horrors of what they were being told and what they were reading and what they were seeing with the newsreels. This is a reminder to me in the 21st century right now. I've been reminded in recent years of how we just do not learn these most critical lessons. I cannot tell you how many people, adult Americans I interact with, when the issue of the Holocaust comes up, they know almost nothing about it. They know something bad happened, and they might know that some Jews were targeted and killed by, they usually don't even know who, but they were targeted and killed by the Germans, they think, right? Just the historical ignorance in our country is on a scale that's unimaginable, to be honest with you. But these lessons cannot be forgotten. They must be learned. And my preaching to my students usually revolves around this particular element. It's really up to you guys to educate your friends or your family, ultimately your children when you have them, and to make sure they understand what actually happened with something like the Holocaust. Because if people forget, then these kinds of events will keep happening, and human beings will suffer needlessly at the hands of monsters like the Nazis, and Hitler and Goebbels and Himmler and the rest. So this is a radical policy. I do want you to see a connection. Radically evil. Both the Germans and the Japanese, who are ultimately allies in the Second World War, they have these racial purity visions. And there's an interesting question that comes into play that many historians and even fiction literature, literary figures have wrestled with. Even the great sci-fi writer Philip K. Dick, who's done a bunch of different stories, right? So he did the original story called "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?" that was made into the film Blade Runner. Minority Report is fictional work by this guy, and then he of course did the stories regarding a fictional world where Germany and Japan emerged victorious in World War II. And it brings this into sharp relief, right? How would this have played out if these, given the fact that both Germany and Japan had these racially pure visions of humanity? And, Philip K. Dick works with that in his story writing. So this issue, we see how this plays out with Nazi Germany. If the Japanese had not been defeated and they'd been allowed to expand and consolidate further, what would they have done with their racial purity clauses? How would that have played out? Would there have been, some sort of a Holocaust perpetrated by the Japanese? These are questions that many have asked. So it's a critical issue. Okay, we are going to move on. I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of other campaigns. We have been talking about SIGINT, and I will come back and talk about one of the more famous applications of SIGINT in just a few minutes. But I do want to come back and at least deal briefly with the application of strategic bombing campaigns, because they have an even greater importance when we get to 1944 and 1945. So I'm reminding you now that we just talked about the initial campaigns, daylight bombing, and there's a degree of success, of course, but these early campaigns in 1943, in particular, late 42 and on through 1943, these bombing campaigns are just horrific experiences, and the Allied bomber crews are paying an unbelievably heavy price because they're flying over these targets and they do not have the air cover that they require. They do not have escorts taking them all the way to their targets and all the way back to their airfields. That begins to change in 1944 when there are a number of different aircraft. The one I'm going to focus on for the moment is the P-51 Mustang, made by a company called North American Aircraft in our country, in the United States. And not only are these just fantastic aircraft, I mean, very maneuverable and, well armed, very fast for propeller-driven aircraft. You see the speed on the slide there, 437 miles per hour for a prop-driven aircraft in World War II. That's really moving. Definitely very fast aircraft. Very good ceiling, very good altitude ceiling for these aircraft as well. Much higher ceiling than or considerably higher ceiling than Me-109s that the Germans were flying. But here's the critical element. You see that range with the external flight tanks attached to beneath the wings of the P-51 Mustang. They had a range of 1,650 miles. And what this ultimately means is that the P-51s, although they are also going to serve as kind of these air superiority fighters, and they're going to be defending bases in different parts of Europe for the Allies, they are going to engage in really, I think their most important application is as escort fighters for these bomber groups. And they're able to, the Allies are able to utilize large squadrons of P-51s and a couple of other different aircraft as well, of course, but they're able to use these aircraft in these huge squadrons as protective barriers for the bombers, and they're able to take them all the way to their targets in Germany itself and take them all the way back to their airfields. And they cut down on the combat losses for the bomber crews dramatically. By the time we get to mid-1944 and moving forward in the war, the casualty rates for B-17 crews, just for instance, they plummet almost 28-29% in just a short period of time. And by the end of the war, when the Luftwaffe has been deeply compromised, the casualty rates have dropped even further. So these are enormously important to understand, that the bombing campaigns in Europe, we'll talk a little bit about the bombing campaigns in the Pacific as well, but these are enormously important turning points. And when you get to late 1944, mid to late 1944, there are some enormously critical bombing campaigns. There's one called Big Week that occurs in 1944, and another critical campaign in early 1945, whereby Germany's industrial production capacity is just absolutely wrecked as a result of the success of these bombing campaigns and the fact that they were finally freed up to make it to these targets, deliver their bomb loads accurately, and to not suffer so many casualties. So this is a critical component that I need you to be aware of. Okay, I want to talk about, this is, the Me-163 is not as important, honestly. It's just, it's a rocket propelled aircraft, so it's not a turbine jet engine aircraft. It's interesting, but really not as important as this next one. The Me-262. So this is a really amazing aircraft developed by the German military. And here's something I just wanted to mention in passing. If the decision had been made to develop this aircraft and to mass produce it, if the Germans had been actually able to mass produce it beginning in early 1943, January, February of 1943, it very well could have shifted the course of the war, and it would have done that because of the capacity for the Germans to have air superiority over much of Western Europe. There was just nothing like it in the sky. It was considerably faster than even the fastest of the Allied planes that were being flown, even than the P-51 Mustang. It was very well armed. It was, it was a little bit difficult to learn how to fly, but once these pilots mastered it, it was actually quite maneuverable. And there really was nothing else that could touch it. And again, one of the things that maybe we should all be grateful for is that the Nazis, they prioritized some other military projects, some rockets. They prioritized developing some industrial production facilities instead of that were meant for producing armor for tanks. So they prioritized some of those things. They did not prioritize the mass production of this particular airplane, this particular aircraft, and ultimately, I think it cost them. If they had actually been able to do it in 43, as I said, things would have been very, very different. Very important aircraft is just a small example of how technology always has the capacity to impact, but we often see that technology during time of war is when you see that impact at its most extreme. And even the small number of these aircraft that flew were pretty amazing, and Allied pilots were just dumbfounded by what they were witnessing. So just imagine if Germany had been able to produce many of these and sent up large squadrons of Me-262s, it would have been very different. Okay, we talked about Rejewski, and we have talked about the applications of SIGINT to various corners of the European war and a little bit in the Asian theater. I talked to you guys about the application of SIGINT, especially through ultra G codes that were broken to the campaigns in North Africa. They also had some application in Sicily and Italy. Now, the Sicilian and the Italian campaigns, the only things I really need you to know for this class, since it's a class in modern East Asia, really, is that once Africa was, I can't find there we go. So yeah, we did talk about El Alamein. So once the Germans were driven out of northern and the northeastern part of North Africa, they jumped back across the Mediterranean and kind of holed up in Sicily. The Allies ultimately conquered Sicily after a fair amount of sacrifice, actually, and then moved on to the Italian campaigns. But they were thrown back when they attempted to move up into what Winston Churchill had called the soft underbelly of Europe by taking Italy from the south and pushing on up through. And what the Allies didn't count on was massively reinforced combat divisions, German combat divisions that were sent south into Italy and threw the Allies back, and they had to kind of lick their wounds and figure out another way to open up the second front. So opening the second front in World War II is one of these, highly important things to understand, because of course you have some diplomatic relationships to wrestle with here. I'm just going to remind you that, of course, you've got, with the Soviets taking the brunt of the German assault in the East, the Soviets are fighting tooth and nail with these German combat divisions, and they're just killing each other wholesale. And so Stalin begins to put a great deal of pressure on his new European ally, Great Britain, and also his American allies, to open up the second front, to take some of the brunt of this German war machine and deal with it and relieve some of that pressure on the Soviets. So the Italian campaign was meant to do that, but of course it did not work. And so by the time you get to late 1943, Stalin, as you can imagine, is essentially screaming in the ear of both FDR and Churchill and demanding that they instruct their military commanders to to find a way to open up that second front. So the second front is critical not only for the course of World War II and finding a way to bring about the German surrender, it's also really critical because you have one of your huge wartime allies who is making some pretty heady demands and actually making fair demands given the sacrifices that the Soviets were paying on the Eastern Front. So spring forward, we talk about this famous juncture of World War II, the invasion of Normandy. So the Norman invasion, the Normandy invasion, which occurs in June of 1944, is probably pretty famous to a lot of people who studied the Second World War, of course. But one of the things that sometimes has been a bit of an afterthought, or it hasn't been discussed at all, has to do with the SIGINT application during the battle for Normandy in June of 44. So what had to happen here before an invasion took place, of course, was that the Germans had to be fooled into believing the Allies were coming at a different location than where they actually were going to land. And so there are a number of deception campaigns that are put into play. The Allies, as we've talked about here, their capacity for SIGINT, for applying intelligence to these combat theaters, was very, very, very heavily guarded secret during World War II, but obviously highly effective. And the ultimate success with the invasion of Normandy comes certainly through the overall planning for the Second Front and the development of the landing craft, the Higgins boats that are used during the assaults, comes from the offshore bombardments, the amphibious assault process that takes place on June the 4th and 5th. The organizational concept for the D-Day invasions is probably one of the most complex in all of human history, overseen by the office of the supreme head of all Allied forces, and that commanding general was none other than Dwight Eisenhower. So Eisenhower and his staff, they're bringing together this highly complex invasion scenario. But here's what they all realize, and this is where SIGINT comes into play. If on June the 6th, when all of the Allies are coming ashore at these various beachheads, right, you have the code names of Juno and Sword and Gold and Omaha and the rest. If all of the Allied forces are pouring ashore, the reality is that for the first 48 to 72 hours, almost all of these forces that come ashore are going to be infantry groups. Very few tank groups that are going to be waiting ashore. So the German combat divisions were very heavy in northwestern France. They did understand that the Allied invasion was going to be in the region of Normandy, perhaps, or a little bit eastward towards Belgium, and there were 58 German combat divisions that were scattered around that part of the map. On the day of June the 6th, 1944, the Allies, through their intelligence gathering apparatus, they actually knew where 56 of the 58 German combat divisions were located, and they knew a fair amount about each of those combat divisions. The overall commanders, the general size of the combat size of each particular army group, and things along those lines. But here's a critical reality. The Allies knew that on the day that this all happened, there could be disaster. A very disastrous event could very easily happen, and that was simply this. With all these infantry groups coming ashore in Normandy, what would happen if 10 or 15 German armored divisions pour in from toward the Allied left flank and crash into it, sending the Second Front invasion back into the English Channel. So these deception campaigns are critical, right? Just for starters, the Allies they spent a lot of time convincing the Germans that the actual invasion was coming between Dover and Calais. That's the closest point, after all, between Britain and continental Europe, in this case, northwestern France. And so the deception campaign here that took place, called Fortitude South, is actually intended to, kind of play to the German expectations. The Germans believe, it seems very intuitive, that any invasion is going to come at those close points there. And so the Germans are setting up the most critical aspects of their defense perimeter in that sector. And the Allies are going to play to that. They're going to make it seem like indeed that is exactly where the invasion has come from. So there are all these fake armies that are created, and fake radio traffic that is specifically created to and allowed, and they allow the Germans to intercept those radio transmissions. And the coding process is actually, it's there, but it is not nearly as difficult to break as it could have been. And so there's the expectation that Germans are going to break those lightly guarded codes and transmissions, and all of this is being created to kind of lull the Germans into a false mode of confidence. But the actual invasion is actually coming down here. So they spread the German forces out, and they land the forces beginning on June the 6th. But as I said, what happens if and when the early implements, the early elements of the Allied forces come ashore, and they are attacked by superior German forces in the region, and particularly armored forces? Well, the Allies have some interesting features when it comes to not only their intelligence gathering apparatus, but also their network of spies. And there's a critical one that comes into play on June the 6th, and his code name is Garbo. And Garbo has been working for the Allies in Whitehall for about almost 2 years at this point in the war. Not quite 2 years, but more like 18 or 19 months, I guess. But Garbo was from Spain originally, was interested in joining the German military at the start of the war, but was denied and was not allowed to do that. And he ultimately is picked up by the British in Barcelona earlier in the war, and they convince this guy to come to work for them. Now, what he has done is this: he's constructed basically a fictitious group of spies, but the reality is this: that Garbo has earlier in the war, he was able to actually visually spot a number of critical combat movements that were being undertaken by the Germans and the Allied forces. He begins to have conversations with one of the German ambassadors who's living in Barcelona, and it becomes pretty clear at that point that this guy, the man who we will come to know as Agent Garbo, appears to be able to supply some actually valuable information. But before the Germans can snatch him up, the British actually succeed in doing that. And they realize that he's already earned the trust of some mid-level German war strategists with his observations of naval combat movements off the coast of Spain, and that he has succeeded in convincing them that he's overseeing this dramatic spy network. And so Whitehall, so the British intelligence apparatus based in Whitehall, they decide to use that to their advantage, and they start to actually help Garbo convince the Germans more and more and more that he is in fact this valuable agent. He in fact tells the Germans that he has moved to Britain, and he has succeeded in infiltrating their command structures, and he's giving them information. The Allies actually pump some valuable information through Garbo throughout the course of the war, to the point where, it's one of the scary parts of World War II in a very real sense, because some of the information coming from guys like Garbo actually did cost Allied lives. It was very measured and it was carefully done as much as possible. But they needed the Germans to actually buy into the expertise and the actual information supplied to them by these individuals. So Garbo, by the time of June 44, is believed by the German High Command to be their highest placed spy in Britain. And transmissions coming from Garbo that the Germans believe are coming just from Garbo, they're actually emanating from Whitehall itself in one of the counter intel rooms. But regardless, the Germans believe that these messages coming from Garbo are absolutely critical, and they will see Hitler's eyes within less than an hour. He has succeeded so shockingly well that he is very highly regarded. Indeed, when the Allied groups pour ashore on June the 6th, there is an order for German combat divisions, armored divisions, to in fact begin to redeploy down to the south and west, and to do exactly what the Allies feared would happen, to crash into the Allied left flank as it begins to come ashore. And Garbo, it's this critical moment that has been reached, and the Allies utilize it. Garbo sends a transmission in which he tells the German High Command, please do not fall prey to this feign. What is happening in Normandy is actually meant to draw you away from the primary attack perimeter up by Calais. Don't fall for it, essentially, is what Garbo tells them. And the German High Command buys it. And they bring those armored divisions back up into their defensive perimeter as they've structured it, and they prepare for the onslaught that they believe is coming. Just an absolutely critical moment. This transmission from Garbo essentially saves the Allied invasion of Normandy in June of 1944. And what's even better is this: the British still want to utilize Garbo, and they want to be able to have the German High Command continue to trust him if possible. So he sends a follow-up message a few days later. Actually, not a few days, about maybe 24 to 36 hours later. And he instructs the German High Command at this point. He says, you know what, here's what's happened. The original plan was for the invasion to take place at Calais, but the feign, the invasion that was intended to just kind of draw German forces away, it has succeeded so outrageously well that the Allies appear to be rolling with that feign invasion, and they're going to utilize it as the actual invading point. And the Germans, there's this degree of trust that's reestablished, and it's really interesting. At the end of the war, Garbo is awarded in secret. He is given the highest military honors for service to one's country by both the British and the Germans. Strangely humorous, I would probably say. And here he is. This is who Garbo actually was. Juan Pujol Garcia, codename Garbo. His identity was not revealed until near his death in 1988 to the general public. It was one of the most closely guarded secrets in the entire world. Those who were still alive from the former Nazi Republic in Germany, those who had even served in the German command structure, were shocked to find this out, that this guy was actually working for the Allies. But he indeed was. Okay, ladies and gents, I am out of time for today. So what I'm going to do is come back on Monday. I'm going to talk a little bit about the end of the war in Europe. Probably not going to spend too much longer, probably another 15 minutes on Europe. And then we're going to shift over and talk about the last campaigns in the Pacific theater. And we'll talk about the efforts by the Allies to bring the Japanese to that unconditional surrender by the spring and summer of 1945. So that's where we're headed. Keep up with your reading. Make sure you keep up with all of your films, that the film options that you need to watch. be aware that you also have the other book to review in the near future. So you've got some things to do. Just stay abreast of all of your required work. That would be my hope and prayer for you. So hang tough. I will hopefully reconnect with you in person on Monday. If not, I'll be sending out an email, basically telling you guys what we're going to do. All right. All right. Thank you. See ya. Have a good rest of your day.